Hi everyone, welcome back to MovieJube and welcome back to some more Lord of the Rings lore. I am very excited to continue. So today's lore learning is going to be about the dragons of Middle-earth, which I'm very excited to learn more about because I only know a bit about Smaug because of The Hobbit, and that's it. So I'm very excited to learn about more of them. So if you're excited as well, please make sure to leave a like and comment your thoughts and subscribe. And first up, we've got the Dragons of Middle-earth updated by Men of the West. And as always, I will be linking the channels in the description and the pinned comment that I watch these videos from. So make sure to check them out. They are very, very awesome and spreading the knowledge which I am now learning from. So let's get into it.
Again, after 100 years, Glaurung, the first of the Loki, the fire drakes of the north, issued from Angband's gates by night. He was yet young and scarce half grown, for long and slow is the life of the dragons. But the elves fled before him to arid Wethrin and Dorthonion in dismay, and he defiled the fields of Ard Gallen. Then Fingon, prince of Hithlum, rode against him with archers on horseback, and hemmed him round with a ring of swift riders. And Glaurung could not endure their darts, being not yet come to his full armory, and he fled back to Angband.
He was still young.
And came not forth again for many years. Greetings and well met, my friends. Yoyston here, and I hope you all are doing well, wherever you are in Middle-earth. Today we will be discussing the dragons once again, as I felt it was necessary to remake this Old Beings of Middle-earth video. After learning much about the dragons over the years, I feel that I have more to add to their stories this time around. I'll link some related articles that helped in the creation of today's video in the description, and I'll also link some related videos there and in the cards above.
Lovely.
Thank you all for joining me today. Let's begin our tale.
Alright.
During the first age of Arda, the Noldor and their allies had pressed Morgoth into a siege, and he was forced to swell his numbers within his fortress of Angband.
Very early in the first age.
To break the siege, he needed more than orcs and balrogs alone, so he created the Loki, the fire drakes or dragons. These massive creatures, whose lives spanned many more years than those of men, were depicted with scales that were strong like armor, claws sharp like swords, and minds that were even sharper.
Damn!
Usually the dragons took the colors of black, red, or gold.
Cool.
They could speak, using forked tongues and razor-sharp teeth, and even Glaurung could place spells upon people through his words and eyes.
Ooh, place
Now, no one
spells.
quite knows how the dragons came to be. They may be corrupted and embodied Maiar, or the machinations and parts of Morgoth's being, what I might call drones.
That's cool.
Or they could be akin to balrogs and other creatures, possibly
like
being
demons.
corrupted great eagles. I doubt they had Fëanor or spirits unless they were Maiar or something else, as they were just likely the perverted creations of Melkor's essence. I'll link a discussion thread in the description below that pertains to all of this. Anyway, many walked upon 4 legs, and some had wings, while others did not. Longworms may have been dragons without legs or wings, as indicated by descriptions of Scatha or Shatha. The pronunciation is disputed in the works. The first winged dragons appeared in the War of Wrath, but before then, they did not have wings.
Interesting.
Another distinction is that some dragons were fire drakes, and could thus breathe fire, while others were cold drakes and could not breathe fire, nor likely frost or anything else. I should also mention that the Lost Road and other writings mention spark dragons, that perhaps give off light, and fish dragons or sea serpents, a group that the Watcher in the Water may perhaps belong to.
Damn.
The canon nature of the non-fire and cold drakes may be disputed, however. The fire drakes are more renowned of the dragons, while the other drakes also served Melkor or Morgoth, and would afterwards inhabit the far north regions of Middle-earth and the Grey Mountains. We will talk more about those dragons later. For now, let's talk about the father of dragons, Glaurung. He first appeared during the Siege of Angband in the year 260 of the First Age. He issued forth from Angband against the elves, but he was not at his full strength or stature, and while he pushed the Noldor from Ard Gallen and defiled such lands, he was quickly pushed back to Angband by Fingon and his company of mounted archers.
His armor wasn't fully
Since
developed.
his natural armor was not fully grown, he could not endure the arrows, and Morgoth was not pleased that his servant had revealed himself thusly. And he would not send forth anything from Angband for nigh 200 years, until 455 of the First Age and the Dagor Bragolok. During the Battle of Sudden Flame, Glaurung issued forth once again, but now he had grown and come into his strength, so he led the assault. He led Balrogs and orcs against the Noldor and their allies, and Glaurung specifically went east against the Sons of Feanor, and he would burn the land between the arms of the Gelion River after defeating riders amongst the elves upon the plain of Lothlin, and coming through the pass of Maglor's Gap. After this, Glaurung would return to Angband. Thus, the Union of Maethros marched against Angband in 472 of the First Age, and Glaurung and his brood came to battle in the early hours of the third morning.
Wow.
They would have destroyed the Noldor had it not been for the Naugrim, the dwarves, who stood against Glaurung and his brood. The dwarves of Belagast could withstand fire better than their allies, for they wore great masks that were hideous to look upon, but gave them protection nonetheless.
I see, yeah.
And they surrounded Glaurung, hacking at him with their axes, until he struck down their dwarven lord Azakal. And as he crawled over the dwarf, Azakal drove a knife into his belly, causing the dragon, along with many beasts, to flee back to Angband, leaving the Balrogs to finish the battle, even as the dwarves took Azakal's body away from the battle, and sang a dirge as they went. Thus started the great animosity between dwarves and dragons.
And dragons, they've had beef for a long minute.
Damn. In 495 of the First Age, and he led the sacking of Nargothrond. Using the bridge over the river Narog, he destroyed the doors of Felagund. He would also put a spell upon Turin, furthering the curse levied upon the House of Horin. In the following year, Glaurung, who resided in Nargothrond upon its riches after driving his orcs away, was disturbed by a company from Doriath. This company included Nienor, Turin's sister, and after creating a reeking steam from the river Narog, he went to Nienor and put a spell upon her also, wiping her memory and leaving her to wander in the wild. Turin would unknowingly meet his sister, and as he did not recognize her and Nienor did not remember him due to Glaurung, they fell in love and were wed. Then, in 498 of the First Age, Glaurung sent orcs against Brethil, where Turin and Nienor lived with other woodsmen. And after Turin revealed himself there, Glaurung came forth the next summer. As Glaurung attempted to cross the gorge of Cabad in Aras to find Turin and his folk, he was stabbed by Turin and his sword Gurthang. Before he died, his blood rendered Turin unconscious, and with his final breath the dragon revealed the truth of his spell to Nienor, who came to the scene of the battle. Glaurung thus died, and Nienor, who thought Turin was dead, was filled with grief, and leapt into Cabad in Aras. After awakening, Turin learned what had happened from Brandir, a witness of the scene, and so he cast himself upon his sword.
Wow,
Thus,
very
Glaurung,
Romeo and
the father
Juliet.
of dragons, was finally ended. But of all dragons, he perhaps dealt the most personal damage to the Free Peoples. Moving on to the other dragons, I'm unsure if they are the children of Glaurung or if they were artificially made, with Glaurung's title of Father of Dragons just being a title and nothing more. Next, we will talk about the Beast of Gondolin, who was a fire drake during the fall of Gondolin, according to the Book of Lost Tales Part 2. All we know is that this dragon fought during the fall of Gondolin in 510 of the First Age, and it either died or stayed with Morgoth's forces afterwards. It carried Balrogs upon its back into the battle, and entered the city through a breach in the wall and sent forth flame in the streets.
That's cool as hell.
Apparently, it almost slew Tur and Ecthelion with its feet, and Tur stabbed him in the foot. We know nothing else about this creature, and any of the other drakes that took part in the battle.
Interesting.
Now we come to the fearsome Ancalagon the Black, largest and mightiest of the dragons of Middle-earth. He, along with some other smaller dragons, were the first of the winged dragons to appear in Middle-earth.
First of the
winged.
winged.
They fought in the War of Wrath after the Balrogs were defeated and driven off. The dragons pushed the Valar and their host back, until the coming of Earendil and the Eagles of Manwë, and together they threw down Ancalagon and his dragons before the rising of the sun, and Ancalagon's massive body broke the Thangorodrim. This would lead to the final defeat of Melkor or Morgoth in the First Age.
I see.
I should also mention Ghostir and his older name Gorthir, which are briefly mentioned in The Lost Road and other writings, and we only know that he was a dragon of Morgoth at some point in the writings of Tolkien. Perhaps he would have been one of the many dragons of the First Age. Anyway, let's move on to the Third Age, as that is the next time we read about dragons. Most, if not all of the dragons went north into the Grey Mountains and beyond. Around the year 2000 of the Third Age, Fram, who was a man of the Eotheid, the ancestors of the Rohirrim, slew Scatha, a longworm of the Grey Mountains who had taken a horde of the dwarves.
So
Fram
the Second
and his
Age was
people
kind of
claimed
peaceful.
the dragon horde, to the dismay of the dwarves whose horde it had once been. And Fram insulted them by sending them the teeth of the dragon and claiming that they are better than the jewels that the dwarves have in their treasuries.
Set the teeth of the dragon.
It's possible that the dwarves killed him for such insults, but the hoard, or at least a part of it, went to the Eothade. And it is from this hoard that the Horn of the Mark, given to Mary from Eowyn, came. The Eothade also named the town Framsburg after Fram, their hero who had saved them from the dragon.
Aww.
Speaking of the dragons of the north, the dwarves would fight them in the War of the Dwarves and Dragons,
I see.
after the dragons stole and plundered the halls and wealth of the dwarves of that land. It is perhaps in and before this war that the dwarves lost 4 of their 7 rings of power to the dragons, who consumed them. After the deaths of King Dain I and his son Fror by a cold drake outside of one of their halls, King Thror led his folk back to Erebor in 2590 of the Third Age. But they would only be safe from the dragons for so long. In 2770,
God, they've had beef with the dragons from the get-go.
Erebor, and he took the Lonely Mountain and its hoard for himself, driving the dwarves into exile. But the quest of Erebor would see the return of the dwarves to their mountain, some dialogue between Bilbo and Smaug after the Hobbit had stolen a golden cup and enraged the dragon, and we would also see the exchange of wit between the dragon and the Hobbit.
Yeah, the wit.
Of all the dragons, Smaug and Glaurung speak the most in Tolkien's works.
Oh, cool, they speak the most.
Eventually, Bilbo reveals to a thrush the weakness of Smaug's underbelly, and the dragon destroys the mountainside before heading to Lake Town, burning it before being shot by Bard the Bowman, who is told the weak point of the dragon by the thrush. Thus Smaug, who is the last named dragon in Middle-earth's history, met his end.
There's a little birdie that told him.
But Smaug was likely not the last dragon, as there were quite possibly other cold drakes in the north, even at the end of the Third Age.
Still
and in the Fellowship of the Ring, Gandalf says, quote, "There is not now any dragon left on earth in which the old fire is hot enough, nor was there ever any dragon, not even Encalagon the Black, who could have harmed the One Ring."
Ooh, that's cool.
Anyway,
so
it seems
no matter how hot
remaining
their fire
dragons were
was,
weaker
they
than
couldn't
those
have
that came before, even in comparison to Smaug,
destroyed the ring.
but they remained in tales told by hobbits and others. And even as we saw in the beginning of the Fellowship of the Ring, the imagery of dragons yet remained in at least one of Gandalf's fireworks of that time. Thus we are brought to the end of our tale about the dragons of Middle-earth.
Wow.
It is worth noting that all of the named dragons were slain by men, save Encalagon, for Earendil was a half-elf who chose to be an elf. But it is interesting that at heart he would have chosen to be a man. Even the death of Encalagon by Earendil and the eagles is similar to the death of Smaug by Bard and the thrush.
Yeah.
These may be just coincidences, or it may be that Tolkien wrote the fall of the dragons that way on purpose.
Yeah, like they always had that kind of
It means something indeed that the courage of men is
weakness.
greater than the strength of the dragons, some of the most powerful evils to ever live in Arda. From the dragons of Middle-earth, we see the danger of weapons of mass destruction, especially when such weapons or their masters are driven by greed.
Wow, how
evil.
interesting.
The only way we can defeat such darkness is to stand together against these weapons and their masters with courage.
Mass destructive weapons, that's so cool.
Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed today's episode. In truth, I'm glad I updated this, as I still have my old script and video, and I find them severely lacking in many details about the dragons. So I'm glad I could make this episode better for all of you. For more details about the stories and descriptions concerning the dragons, check out the articles in the description as well as almost any of the main stories in Tolkien's Legendarium. If you enjoyed today's episode, please hit that like button and share this with a friend. What are your thoughts about the dragons? Let me know in the comments below.
Hell yeah! Okay, and next up we're heading back to Tolkien Untangled, so once again, their channel will be in the description and the pinned comments, and make sure to check them out. And we are going to check out the Dragons of Middle-earth from Tolkien Untangled.
When it comes to fantasy, it's hard to imagine that there is any creature more ubiquitous or universal than the dragon. You know, we have Dungeons and Dragons, Game of Thrones, Harry Potter, Skyrim, World of Warcraft, Shrek. It seems wherever you look, if it's in the fantasy genre, there is a good chance that you'll find a fire-breathing dragon. And although it would be a bit of an overstatement to suggest that Tolkien invented dragons as we know them, I do believe that without him, dragons wouldn't be so familiar to the modern reader. I think it can be argued that Smaug the Golden is both the first great dragon of contemporary fantasy and the last great dragon of the old Germanic and Slavic and wider European mythologies.
I see.
Smaug is the reason that, although you may struggle to picture like a manticore or a cockatrice, every single one of us knows what a dragon is.
Yeah.
Alla tulia meldonia ahara mariese, My name is Rainbow Dave, and welcome to another Tolkien lore video.
Thank you, Rainbow Dave.
So today we are going to discuss the dragons of the Legendarium.
Oh yeah.
But by starting with Smaug, I am getting a little bit ahead of myself. Because although he is the first dragon that Tolkien named in his published works,
Oh, was he?
within the chronology of Arda, Smaug is the last of the great dragons.
Right.
And there is a long heritage of monsters that preceded him.
Cool.
So in the annals of Arda, the very first dragon, the father of them all, is the great worm Glaurung.
Great worm.
And Glaurung's date
Glaurung.
of birth, or I guess hatching, is unknown.
Hatching.
His master Morgoth intentionally kept Glaurung's existence a secret until he was ready to be unleashed upon the unsuspecting elves. But, as I guess is quite common with rebellious young beings, Glaurung was impatient.
He's a
And he
fierce little
emerged from his
teenager.
master's dungeons 200 years before Morgoth was ready to unveil him. But Glaurung's official debut came with the disastrous Battle of Sudden Flame, which broke the military supremacy of the Noldor elves and their allies, and Glaurung was the reason for all this sudden flame.
Yeah,
I
I
mean,
can
the
imagine.
Balrogs helped, but the father of the dragons led the largest army of orcs and evil things that the world had ever seen.
Sheesh.
And the elves and men withered before him.
Damn.
But the
and that's
Battle
really cool
of Sudden
art.
Flame was just a taste of the horror that Glaurung would eventually unleash. Only 17
deadly,
years
deadly
later
dragon.
came the Battle of Unnumbered Tears. And this was arguably the greatest loss ever suffered by the free peoples in Middle-earth's history.
Okay, so the most
In this
casualties.
battle, Glaurung once again emerged from Morgoth's fortress, but this time he was not the only one of his kind. Tolkien tells us about Glaurung's brood, which he describes as many and terrible.
Damn.
And these children of Glaurung's cause immense devastation
Sheesh.
upon the field of battle.
Yeah, no wonder that
Now,
was the most
within
casualties.
Middle-earth, not all dragons are created equal. And, as is always the case with Tolkien, there are a few different types of dragons throughout the Legendarium. But Glaurung and his brood are among some of the most dangerous, for they are all of the class of Uruloki, known more commonly as the Fire Drakes.
Yeah.
And as the name suggests, Glaurung and his brood were all endowed with the ability to breathe dragonfire. And dragonfire is no ordinary thing. In The Lord of the Rings, we're told that it's hot enough to melt rings of power. The only other place where that could happen is, of course,
Mount
in
Doom.
the fires of Mount Doom.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, in the Battle of Unnumbered
But maybe
Tears,
not the One
Glaurung
Ring?
and his
I'm not
children lay waste to the lands of the sons of Feanor, and they sweep apart the two factions of elven allies. And when that is done, Glaurung went after Lord Azaghal, who is the chief of the dwarves of the Blue Mountains. And although Azaghal's dwarven army hewed Glaurung and they sent him into a rage, they were unable to kill him. And when the battle was over, Azaghal was just another slain hero who'd met his end in the fires of Glaurung. And there's something really interesting here. Because although in the First Age dragons are portrayed as the destroyers of many mighty elven armies, and in later ages they're known as like the great enemies of the dwarves, in Tolkien's entire Legendarium, we aren't told of a single named dragon who is ever killed by either an elf or a dwarf.
Wow.
Every
So it
dragon
really was
that
only
dies
humans.
is slain by a single mortal man.
That's really
standing
cool.
alone in single combat.
And it has that reference to the old
And this brings
Testament
us
of
to the eventual
David and
doom
Goliath.
of Glaurung. Now, I don't want to unnecessarily spoil anything. I'll cover this in much greater detail in future Silmarillion videos. But just like with all future dragons, Glaurung is eventually slain by a mortal man.
Mortal man.
And there's no battle. There are no armies. There is simply Glaurung and the son of Húrin.
That's badass.
But before the hero's black sword pierces Glaurung's belly, Tolkien demonstrates some of the other lesser-known powers that Glaurung the Great Worm possesses. Because, although the dragon, I guess, is most famous for his fiery and poisonous breath, he does have another power that proves perhaps even more destructive. You see, Glaurung is a master of minds. Not unlike Sauron, he uses deception against his enemies.
That is cool.
But that is not the limit of what he can do. More than once in the Legendarium, Glaurung uses his power to hypnotize his enemies, and he freezes them in place, which renders them completely helpless against him. But even this is not his greatest gift. At one point in the story, Glaurung comes across a young maiden, and he uses some sort of spell to utterly obliterate her mind. He destroys her memories. And when he's finished with her, the maiden is left with no idea who she is, or why she's there, or even what her name is. And, well, just like most of the tales in the Children of Húrin, the story ends really badly.
Yeah, I want to learn more about the Children of Húrin.
But eventually Glaurung is slain. And so he becomes the first in a long line of dragons to be killed by mannish heroes. Over the ages, he will be joined by the long worm Scatha, who was slain by Fram, an ancestor of the men of Rohan. Then there is the Beast of Gondolin, who is vanquished by Tuor, who happens to be the only man in a city full of elves.
Oh,
and of course, lastly,
cool.
Smaug the Golden is not slain by dwarves, or by wizards, or by hobbits.
Not even a hobbit.
By Bard the Bowman and
human.
his black arrow. However, of all the dragons in Tolkien's Legendarium, there is one who stands out amongst all others. One dragon who is undoubtedly the greatest of his kind, the mightiest of them all, and the ancestor of all future winged dragons.
Ooh, yes.
His name is Ancalagon the Black.
Ancalagon.
Now, the truth is that we don't know a huge amount
dragon.
about Ancalagon, but we do know that Morgoth bred him to be the greatest dragon that ever lived.
And he was the largest.
And he was unleashed in Morgoth's final hour.
Wow.
Now, there is a little bit of debate amongst fans in regards to Ancalagon's size. You see, if you Google him, you'll probably find an image comparing the sizes of all the dragons in Middle-earth, and Ancalagon will no doubt be outrageously huge. And to be fair, Ancalagon was massive, but he probably wasn't that massive. I mean, we know he could fly, and even in a fantasy setting, like, the laws of physics do have a limit. Although, again, to be fair, we are told that when Ancalagon was cast down, his body fell from the sky and it broke all three of the tallest mountains in Middle-earth when he landed on top of them. So he is huge, don't get me wrong, but
maybe not that
I would argue
huge.
that this breaking of the mountains is more due to his power than his size. After all, we're also told that when Gandalf killed the Balrog in The Lord of the Rings and he cast its body off the peak of Ziraxigil, it also broke the mountainside.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that the Balrog is like the size of a mountain.
Okay.
Anyway, regardless of the question of his size,
cool,
Ancalagon's might is undeniable. For a moment, it looked like he might be powerful enough to drive back the combined strength of the Valar. And Tolkien tells us that Ancalagon led the vanguard of the winged dragons that had never before been seen. And so sudden and ruinous was the onset of that dreadful fleet that the host of the Valar was driven back. For the coming of the dragons was with great thunder and lightning and a tempest of fire.
Damn.
But
I wonder
as
if
with all others,
enough dragons
even
could have defeated all the
Ancalagon
Valar.
was eventually slain. And just like all others, his doom came at the hand of a single individual, Eärendil the Mariner. Now, referring to Eärendil as like a mortal man is a little bit misleading.
Okay.
Because technically, he is the son of a mortal man and an immortal elf.
Okay.
In fact, he is the only pure 50-50 man-elf hybrid in the whole Legendarium.
Oh, cool.
Well, except for Galador and Gillimith, who I mentioned in that video about the half-elves of Gondor. But for most of his life, Eärendil is counted amongst the race of men.
Okay.
And just like Thram and Tuor and Bard and the son of Húrin, he alone takes down Ancalagon in what must have been one of the most epic battles in Middle-earth's history.
Yeah.
So, with Ancalagon dead, the race of dragons seemed to disappear from the world for a very long time.
Yeah, the
Throughout
Second
the
Age.
entire Second Age, the longest of the ages, there is absolutely no reference to any living dragon of any kind.
What?
But they were not all
I
gone.
wonder why.
And in the Third Age, dragons returned to once again plague the free peoples of the North. But many of these dragons
dark
were a little
energy?
bit different. So, we're told by Gandalf in The Lord of the Rings that the 7 dwarven rings were the foundations of each of the 7 hordes of the dwarf kings of old.
Okay.
And it's highly likely that these treasure hoards were what attracted the dragons of the Grey Mountains in the first place. Gandalf tells us that the dragons devoured them, and of the 7 rings, some were consumed in fire.
Wow.
And in the year 2570 of the Third Age, dragons returned from the wastes beyond, and thus began the Great War of the Dwarves and the Dragons. However, as I said, not all these dragons were like the Uruloki of the First Age. Many of these dragons were cold drakes, known as Foaloki. And Tolkien tells us that they are cold as in the nature of snakes and serpents.
Like reptilians.
And of them are many having wings that go with the uttermost noise and speed.
Oh, they're really fast.
So, these dragons can fly, but they can't breathe fire.
Yeah.
However, the War of the Dwarves and Dragons is not a happy story, I'm afraid. For 20 years, the dwarves fought the dragons, and in that time, they held their ground in the Grey Mountains. But ultimately, this was not a war the dwarves could win.
No.
Eventually, King Dain I and his son Thror were killed by a cold drake outside their very own doors. And this marked the end of the dwarves' resistance in the Grey Mountains.
Damn.
King Dain's eldest son, and now his heir, Thror, which is that same Thror who eventually becomes the grandfather of Thorin Oakenshield, led many of the dwarven survivors to Erebor, where they rebuilt the great dwarven kingdom under the mountain. And for 200 years, the dwarves of Erebor prospered under their new king, Thror. However, the dragons that killed Thror's father were not gone. And in the year 2770 of the Third Age, Thror would face a terror far greater than the one that killed his father and brother.
Fire breathing.
Because, of course, 2770 is the year that Smaug the Golden descended from the north like a hurricane, and he sacked Erebor. He killed every guard who came out to challenge him, he destroyed the city of Dale, and for the following 171 years, Smaug slept on his newly acquired pile of gold.
So creepy.
Now, I reckon we all know the story of Smaug's eventual demise, and I'm not going to explain like the entire plot of The Hobbit, but when Bard the Bowman fired that fateful arrow, not only did he kill Smaug and rescue Laketown and avenge Dale, but he also ended a far greater conflict. He killed the last great dragon of the North. And he finally ended the threat that Morgoth had unleashed with Glaurung at the Battle of Sudden Flame
from the first age.
6,517 years earlier. But there is one last thing to say about Smaug. Because although he is the last great dragon of the Legendarium, one could argue that he is also the last great dragon of a far older literary tradition. You see, although I think it's fair to say that Tolkien popularized dragons in the genre of modern fantasy, like he made them famous, he did not, of course, invent them.
No.
Dragons have been staples of Slavic and Iberian and Brittonic folklore, and perhaps the most famous tales of dragons and mortal men, at least in Western European traditions, comes from the writings of Tolkien's beloved ancestors, the Anglo-Saxons. So, between 1920 and 1926, Tolkien jumped headfirst into the realm of Old English literature by translating the epic tale of Beowulf into modern English.
Beowulf.
And of course, at the end of the tale, the hero Beowulf, spoiler for a poem that's literally over 1,000 years old, dies slaying a giant fire-breathing dragon. Furthermore, in the tale of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which Tolkien translated in 1920, whilst working as his university's youngest professor, by the way, Sir Gawain battles fire-breathing worms. And of course, perhaps the most famous of all the Anglo-Saxon tales to feature fire-breathing dragons is the Norse-Germanic Volsunga saga, starring the fire-breathing monster Fafnir and the mortal man Sigurd.
Wow.
And this is the same Sigurd, or Siegfried, that Christoph Waltz talks about in Django Unchained, and he's one of the main characters in Wagner's The Ring Cycle. Now, there are a number of striking similarities between Fafnir and Smaug, as well as between Fafnir and Glaurung. In fact, Bilbo's dialogue with Smaug almost perfectly mirrors Sigurd's exchange with Fafnir. And Glaurung's description as a flightless dragon who hoarded gold and breathes poison also mirrors Fafnir perfectly. So I
was
guess
Fafnir
this
the origin of
means that
dragons'
although
disease?
dragons have been a part of Western imagination for over 1,000 years, and although dragons have become one of the most recognizable elements of modern fantasy, it is Tolkien who tied these two strands together.
And it is interesting
And he
how visually
dragons
that does
as
look
we
like
know them
Eastern
today.
dragons.
So,
of, like,
not too long ago, I
Chinese
was with my nephew, and we were watching a movie, and he wanted to
mythology.
put on How to Train Your Dragon.
Oh yeah.
And so I watched it, and to be honest, I enjoyed it. But I was immediately struck by the fact that the humans, despite speaking with Scottish accents, all claim that they are Vikings. Why is it that even in a 21st century children's movie, we associate dragons with Old Norse mythology?
I guess because of Fafnir.
Because of Tolkien.
Oh.
It's because Tolkien created the first dragons of the modern era by adapting the ancient dragons of Europe's historic past.
Okay.
Think about that the next time you see a dragon on TV.
Cool.
Anyway, thank you all very much for watching. That's it for this video. But if you enjoyed it, there are plenty more just like it on the channel, so check them out. And as always, until next time, my dear friends, much love. Stay groovy, and Navaya Melanine.
Oh. Alrighty, that was the great dragons of Middle-earth, and I'm so glad I learnt about them because I didn't really know that there was like so many different types of dragons. I thought maybe there was like 3 in total, but oh my gosh, that was a lot. And for some reason, the Second Age was like a time of peace for people dealing with dragons. I mean, there was other wars and stuff going on, but not dragons going on in the Second Age. So yeah, that was really cool to learn, and I hope you enjoyed watching. So please make sure to leave a like and comment your thoughts, and make sure to subscribe if you would like. And once again, I'll leave the channels of both Tolkien Untangled and Men of the West in the description and pinned comments, so make sure to check them out. Alrighty, see you guys in the next one. Bye!